we'll talk about a number of things related to making your faith unshakable. To wrap our heads around this, let's start by defining faith. What do we mean by that? There are different kinds of faith, and then we'll focus on that one that as Christians, we want that one to be unshakable. We'll cover 4 kinds of faith here, and this is not exhaustive, by the way. You could likely think of more, but let's start with the lowest level of faith, irrational faith. That's believing something when the evidence points in a different direction. The belief is opposite the evidence.
Right. And we did a show on this a few years ago titled The Irrational Faith of Evolution. We showed how, with the massive amount of scientific and historical support for biblical creation, it's irrational to believe that the universe is the product of natural laws and random processes with no intelligent design.
It is, yeah. Mark Twain, the famous author, wrote, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." Now, that is a great definition of irrational faith. You know something, yet you believe the opposite, right? For example, you know that if you're at the edge of a cliff, you know that thin air will not support the weight of a human, yet you step off anyways, believing that somehow you're not going to fall to your death, right? That's irrational.
Yeah, and that's crazy, right?
Yes.
Yet in that previous episode, we gave examples to verify that belief in evolution really is irrational. It goes against scientific evidence that points in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, now it's ironic that many evolution believers say they follow science. But if evolutionists really did follow the science where it leads, they'd be creationists.
That's right, yeah. Blind faith is the next kind of faith. Blind faith is a leap into the dark. There's no evidence or experience to warrant this kind of faith. Now, Christians are often caricatured, right, as having this kind of faith.
All the time.
Most non-Christians think we check our brains at the church door and ignore logic and reason. That's what Christianity is all about, right? But that's not true, of course. But there you have the third kind of faith.
Yeah, the next kind of faith, or level of faith, as you like, and this is the kind that everyone has, by the way. This is warranted faith, or human faith. It's a faith that's warranted by evidence or by human experience. For example, you have a warranted faith that when you go to a restaurant and you eat the food they put in front of you, it's not going to kill you, right? That's what kind of faith that is.
Right, and we could mention that this kind of faith is related to apologetics, which is giving a reasoned defense of biblical truth, right?
But apologetics goes beyond human faith. It involves actively collecting evidence to show that the statements made by God and the events recorded there in the Bible are logical and true. Now that could be labeled reasonable faith. That's a slightly different category of faith. It's not included in our list of 4 here today, but it's related to warranted faith.
And the Apostle John actually states that the reason he wrote his account of the life of Jesus is to supply evidence that would lead people to a reasonable faith in Christ, which would lead to salvation. In John 20:30-31, he writes this, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But here it is, these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name."
Yeah, if you want an example of that, an example of warranted or reasonable faith, that's an example is doubting Thomas. And
that's right.
I gotta say, almost every time I hear pastors discuss this, I get annoyed, right? That we shouldn't need evidence, that we should just believe as Christians. For those who aren't familiar with the account of doubting Thomas, so-called, after Jesus dies and comes back to life, almost all of the apostles doubted. Then Jesus visits them alive, and they believe. But Thomas isn't there. They tell Thomas about it, and he says, unless I see him and examine the evidence firsthand, I'm not going to believe. But the other disciples were exactly the same as him. They were in the same boat. They didn't believe either until they saw the evidence firsthand.
And that actually sounds reasonable, almost scientific,
Yes.
right? He wasn't taking people's word for it. After all, they all knew Jesus was dead.
Yeah.
We should all be like Thomas.
Right.
After examining the evidence for the risen Christ, he came to a rational, logical, evidence-based conclusion.
Yes.
And the only one that made sense. His response was, "My Lord and my God."
Yes, an appropriate response, right?
Yeah.
Thomas, like the other disciples, had a warranted or a reasonable faith. There's an example of that. after they examined the evidence that Jesus was alive. But there's one more level of faith, the highest, most sure faith.
Right, and that's what could be labeled biblical faith.
Yes.
Ephesians 2:8-9 describes this kind of faith. This is what it says: "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." See, biblical faith doesn't originate with us.
Yeah.
It's not your own doing. It's not a result of works. Saving faith is a gift from God.
Yes. Yeah, Hebrews 11:1, the famous faith chapter, defines this sort of faith right there in verse 1. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The faith described here is of the most solid possible conviction. It's a God-given assurance of a future reality, beyond warranted or reasonable faith that's based on empirical evidence. In other words, it's beyond what is scientifically supported.
Right.
Yeah. Science has limits, by the way, to what it can prove. This is a work of the Spirit only available to Christians, those who've been regenerated by the Spirit.
Right. And so there's a quick summary of several kinds of faith.